You know what finally cracked my skull open about wood? It wasn't a dovetail. It wasn't some hand-cut mortise and tenon that fit like a glove. It was a bearing, a propeller shaft bearing, buried in the stern tube of a warship, spinning underwater in saltwater, under thousands of pounds of load for decades. And it was made of wood, not bronze, not steel, not some space-age polymer. Wood. A plain-looking lump of dark tropical hardwood that most people walk right past at a salvage yard without a second glance. I found a chunk of it sitting on a workbench at a boatyard in Maine maybe 8 years ago. Old guy there picked it up, handed it to me, and said, "Feel how heavy that is." That's what kept half the Navy's shafts turning for 100 years. I thought he was pulling my leg. He wasn't. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly why this wood outperforms steel and bronze in one of the most punishing mechanical environments on Earth, point by point, and why the Navy figured this out a century before most of us ever heard of it. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'll show you a dead simple way to verify whether a piece of this wood is genuine or if someone's trying to sell you a fake. Let's get into it. The wood is called lignum vitae. It comes from a small, slow-growing tree in the Caribbean and the northern coast of South America. 2 species, primarily, Guaiacum officinale and Guaiacum sanctum. And for roughly 150 years, from the age of steam right through World War II and beyond, it was the standard stern tube bearing material for warships, destroyers, icebreakers, cargo ships, and submarines across the British Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and half the merchant fleets on Earth. That's not folklore. That's engineering history. Here's why the old shipwrights trusted it. The environment inside a stern tube is about as hostile as it gets for any material. You've got a heavy steel shaft spinning at speed, submerged in salt water, exposed to silt and grit and marine growth, generating heat and friction continuously. Any bearing material you put in there has to handle all of that at once, for years, without regular access for maintenance. Metal bearings can do the job, but they fight that environment every step of the way. They corrode, they need grease, they run hot, they score the shaft. The old shipwrights looked at that problem and came to a conclusion that sounds insane until you understand the science. They said, let the ocean do the cooling, let the wood do the lubricating, and get out of the way. That philosophy carried lignum vitae bearings all the way from 19th century steamships to the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, launched in 1954. The Nautilus ran on lignum vitae stern tube bearings. Think about that for a moment. The most advanced vessel in the United States Navy, pushing the absolute frontier of propulsion technology, and they chose a piece of tropical hardwood to keep the propeller shaft turning. They didn't choose it because they were sentimental. They chose it because nothing else worked as well. So let's run the matchup. Metal bearings versus lignum vitae, point by point. The first thing you need to understand is the resin. This is the heart of everything lignum vitae does, and it's the part that stopped me cold when I first learned about it. Lignum vitae contains roughly 25 to 30% natural resin by weight. That's not a typo. Nearly a third of the wood, by weight, is a waxy, self-lubricating resin called guaiac resin. It's embedded throughout the grain structure, saturating the fibers. Now here's what happens when you use this wood as a bearing surface. As the shaft spins against the end grain, friction generates a small amount of heat. That heat causes the resin to migrate toward the bearing surface, where it forms a thin, self-renewing, lubricating film. The harder the shaft works, the more resin comes to the surface. The bearing literally lubricates itself automatically with no external system whatsoever. Compare that to a metal bearing. A bronze or steel bearing running in salt water needs a constant supply of grease or oil. That means a lubrication system with pumps, seals, lines, and fittings. Every one of those components can fail. Every seal can leak. And when a seal does leak, you're pumping petroleum-based lubricant directly into the ocean. Lignum vitae needs none of that. No grease gun, no oil reservoir, no seals, no pumps. The wood handles it on its own. When I first understood that, I just stood there in that boatyard, staring at the old guy. I said, "You're telling me the wood greases itself?" He said, "Son, the wood greases itself better than you ever could." He was right. Now, the second point in this matchup is what happens when saltwater enters the picture. For a metal bearing, saltwater is the enemy. It corrodes steel. It attacks bronze through dezinsification. It accelerates galvanic corrosion when dissimilar metals are in contact. Every metal bearing in a marine environment is in a constant losing battle against the water it sits in. Lignum vitae flips that completely. The bearing is designed to run wet. Saltwater is the cooling medium. The bearing staves are installed with grooves cut along their faces, typically running lengthwise, and seawater flows through those grooves continuously while the shaft turns. That water carries away friction heat and flushes out silt, sand, and grit that would otherwise grind against the shaft. The wood itself does not corrode. It does not rust. It does not suffer from electrolysis. It's essentially immune to everything saltwater throws at it. And because the resin in the wood is hydrophobic, the bearing surface stays slick even while water rushes past it. The saltwater does the cooling. The resin does the lubricating. They work together instead of fighting each other. I remember asking that old boatyard fellow what happens to the grooves over time. He said they wear down slowly, evenly, over years and years. And when they finally wear enough to need attention, you pull the staves, flip them, recut the grooves, and put them back in. He'd seen sets last 30 years. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third point is one that takes this out of the boatyard and into military history, and it's the one that gave me chills when I first heard it. Lignum vitae bearings are nearly silent. Metal-on-metal bearings generate noise. There's no way around it. Steel turning against bronze or steel produces a hum, a whine, sometimes an outright squeal, especially under heavy load. On a surface vessel, that's an annoyance. On a submarine, it's a death sentence. Acoustic signature is everything in submarine warfare. Every sound your vessel makes travels through the water and can be picked up by enemy sonar. A noisy bearing is a beacon. It tells everyone exactly where you are. Lignum vitae, with its self-lubricating resin film and its natural vibration-damping properties, runs so quietly that it became the preferred bearing material for submarine propeller shafts. The USS Nautilus didn't use lignum vitae because it was traditional. It used lignum vitae because the engineers could not find a synthetic material that ran quieter, would beat every alloy and every polymer they tested for acoustic performance in that application. Think about that the next time someone tells you wood is a primitive material. The most advanced submarine ever built chose wood over metal for a critical rotating component because the wood was quieter, smoother, and more reliable. Now, the fourth point answers the obvious objection. Everyone's thinking it. Wood is soft. How can wood possibly hold up as a bearing surface against a spinning steel shaft? Lignum vitae is not soft. It has a Janka hardness rating of over 4,000 pounds force. For comparison, white oak comes in around 1,300. Hard maple is around 1,400. Hickory, which most people think of as about as hard as domestic wood gets, sits around 1,800. Lignum vitae is more than double that. And here's the number that really gets people. The specific gravity of lignum vitae is between 1.05 and 1.14. Water has a specific gravity of 1. This wood is denser than water. It sinks. If you drop a piece of lignum vitae into a bucket, it goes straight to the bottom like a stone. That density is what gives it its extraordinary compression resistance and wear characteristics. The bearing surfaces are installed with the end grain facing the shaft, which puts the hardest, most compression-resistant orientation of the wood directly against the rotating steel. Under load, those end grain fibers resist deformation in ways that genuinely shock anyone who thinks of wood as a soft material. In service, lignum vitae stern tube bearings have documented lifespans of 30 to 50 years of continuous operation. Some have gone longer. Try getting that out of a bronze bushing in saltwater. The fifth point is the one that changed how I think about material selection entirely. Metal bearings don't just wear themselves out. They damage the shaft they're supposed to protect. When silt or sand or any kind of marine debris enters a metal bearing, those particles embed in the softer bearing metal and act like sandpaper against the shaft. Over time, the shaft gets scored, grooved, and worn. Replacing or re-sleeving a propeller shaft is enormously expensive. Lignum vitae does the opposite. The water-flushing grooves push debris out before it can embed. The resin film on the bearing surface is slick enough that most particles slide across it, rather than lodging in it. And when wear does occur, the wood wears sacrificially. It gives up its own surface slowly and evenly, protecting the shaft it rides on. The bearing is designed to be the cheaper, replaceable component. The shaft is the expensive part, and the wood guards it. That's a design philosophy I had never encountered in any woodworking context. The idea that the material should protect what it touches, even at its own expense. It changed how I think about jigs, fixtures, and contact surfaces in my own shop. So if this wood is so extraordinary, why have most people never heard of it? The honest answer is two things happened at once. First, we cut down too much of it. Lignum vitae grows incredibly slowly. Some trees take over 100 years to reach harvestable size. Centuries of heavy demand for bearings, mallets, bowling balls, and other applications depleted the natural stands across the Caribbean and Central America. Both species are now listed under CITES, the international treaty that regulates trade in endangered species. Second, modern composites caught up. Materials like Thornton, Duramax, and rubber stave bearings were engineered specifically to replicate what lignum vitae does naturally. And I'll be honest with you, they work, they're good products. But every single one of them was designed by studying what the wood did first and then trying to copy it synthetically. The wood was the original engineering solution. The composites are the imitation. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I believed myself for decades, that lignum vitae quietly disproves. The first pattern is the assumption that metal is always the stronger choice for mechanical applications. Most of us grew up believing that if something needs to handle load, friction, and wear, you reach for metal. Wood is for furniture. Metal is for machines. Lignum vitae demolishes that assumption. In the specific application of a water-lubricated bearing under continuous rotational load, wood outperformed every metal the world's navies could throw at the problem for over a century. The second pattern is the belief that lubrication always requires an external system. We're so accustomed to grease fittings, oil reservoirs, and maintenance schedules that we forget a material can carry its own lubricant internally. Lignum vitae's resin system is more reliable than any pump because it can't fail. There's no mechanism to break. The lubricant is the material itself. The third pattern is dismissing natural materials as primitive. I catch myself doing this. We assume that newer is better, that synthetic means superior. But the engineers who designed the propulsion system for the first nuclear submarine looked at every option available to them in 1954 and chose a piece of wood. Not because they were behind the times, because the wood was ahead of the alternatives. The fourth pattern is ignoring the acoustic and tactile properties of our materials. We think about strength and appearance, but we rarely think about how a material sounds or feels under friction. The submarine engineers understood that sound is a material property, just as real as hardness or density. That's a lesson worth carrying into the shop. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. If you ever come across a piece of wood being sold as lignum vitae, whether at a salvage yard, an estate sale, or an online dealer, here's how to verify it's genuine. First, pick it up. Lignum vitae is startlingly heavy. If a piece the size of your fist doesn't feel like it's made of lead, it's probably not the real thing. Second, drop it in water. Genuine lignum vitae sinks. Every time. If it floats, walk away. Third, take a sharp chisel or a knife and scrape the end grain. Real lignum vitae will produce a waxy, resinous shaving, and you'll smell a distinct, slightly sweet, medicinal scent. That's the guaiac resin. No other common wood smells quite like it. If you find genuine reclaimed stock, and it does come up from old bearing replacements in decommissioned vessels, you can turn it into beautiful mallets, plane soles, tool handles, and small boxes. Just know that your tools will need resharpening more often. This wood is brutal on edge tools. Use carbide when you can and take light passes. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. The Navy figured out over 100 years ago that a slow-growing tropical tree could outperform the best alloys their foundries could produce in one of the most demanding mechanical applications ever devised. They didn't publicize it because they didn't need to. It just worked. And when the wood became scarce, they quietly moved on to synthetics, and the knowledge faded into technical manuals that nobody outside of marine engineering ever reads. But now you know. And the next time someone tells you wood is just for furniture, you can tell them it also ran the propeller shaft of the first nuclear submarine. Thanks for watching, folks. I'll see you on the next one.